Southern Secession, 1830 to 1861. These are our core objectives for this chapter. Please make sure that you review these before beginning to read the chapter. Beginning in the 1830s and 1840s, America became interested in this concept of manifest destiny. And when we look at manifest destiny as it relates to U.S. history, basically what it means is Americans began to believe that it was their destiny, divine from God, that they should control all of the lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is that in the 1830s and 40s, there were other people that inhabited many of those lands in the West. We have the Native Americans. We also have, of course, the Spanish that control much of the lands in the far West, like California. But Americans believed that God wanted us to have these lands because we have a better governmental system than other people. There is a short little 3-minute YouTube video that goes into a little more discussion on this that you can click on if you want a little further in-depth discussion on manifest destiny. But by the time we get to the 1844 election, manifest destiny really had become the central focus in American politics. And in that election, James K. Polk will run as the Democratic candidate, and Henry Clay will run as the Whig candidate. And the central focus of this election will be really two areas of land that the U.S. wanted to gain. One was Texas, and Polk said that the United States should re-annex Texas, which is an interesting concept because if you go back and remember when we were studying the Florida Purchase Treaty, one of the aspects of that treaty was the U.S. gave up all of our claims to Texas. But by 1844, things have really changed in Texas. Texas has won their independence from Mexico, and many of the inhabitants of Texas are actually American citizens, and there's a big drive in Texas to become part of the United States. Another thing that the Polk candidacy advocated was to control Oregon all the way up to what we call the 54° 40 mark, which is the 54-degree parallel mark, which goes deep into Canada. Now, with the situation in Oregon, beginning in the 1820s, soon after that Florida Purchase Treaty, the United States and Great Britain had entered into what we called a joint occupation agreement for Oregon. And the situation worked very well for about 20 years. We did not have a huge number of citizens living in Oregon, nor did the British. So jointly occupying it with no one country controlling it politically was working very well. But by the time we get to the 1840s, more and more Americans have begun to move into that region. You know, we have the Oregon Trail where we have this westward expansion into Oregon. And so Polk is calling for America to control that area. Now, Henry Clay is also an advocate for manifest destiny, but not as rigidly as Polk. Clay is much more of a diplomat. He does not want to cause any conflicts with foreign countries. And so, especially as it came to Texas, Clay said that the United States should only annex Texas if Mexico agreed to that. And of course, that's not something Americans want to hear. We don't like to believe that we need to ask permission from another country to do something that we want to do. So as you can imagine, Henry Clay will lose that election and James K. Polk will win by a very large majority. After becoming president, Polk began searching for a way to fulfill his campaign promises, and he first began looking at Oregon. And as we had stated earlier, we're under this joint occupation agreement with the British regarding Oregon. He does not want to go to war with the British, so the first thing he does is offers a compromise to the British. What if we divide the Oregon Territory? Instead of the U.S. claiming all of it up to the 54-degree parallel mark, what if we split it at the 49th parallel? That's roughly the border that had been established between the U.S. and Canada east of the Rocky Mountains, and so he felt that that was a good idea. The British at first declined the offer. The thing that bothered the British was that the Columbia River, which was the main river in that region, the mouth of the Columbia River would be in the American territory, and they were concerned that it would hurt them with trade. So Polk invoked a provision of our joint occupation agreement, giving the British a 1-year notice that we were going to end the joint occupation. Basically what that does is it gives us a year to find a peaceful solution to the Oregon situation, and if we don't find a solution within that year, then we may end up going to war. But the British did not want to go to war over Oregon, nor did the United States. And so in that year period, we began this very intense negotiation about how to settle the Oregon question. And in 1846, we will agree to what becomes known as the Oregon Treaty. In the Oregon Treaty, the U.S. and Britain agreed that the 49th parallel will become the border of Oregon, stretching from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Also, and we'll see on the map on the next slide, Vancouver Island, which would be cut by that 49th parallel mark, Vancouver Island would go to the British. So Vancouver will remain part of Canada. It will remain British territory. The waterway around Vancouver Island is known as the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and we agreed that there would be free navigation of the Straits of Juan de Fuca. What that means is both countries can freely use that waterway. And the United States also agreed that the British would have free use of the Columbia River. We will not impede their use of the Columbia River. This map shows us what we were discussing on the previous slide. You can see if you look all the way up to that top red line, that's the 54°40 mark, which we were originally claiming as the border of Oregon. But lower down, you will see the 49th degree parallel mark where it says Buchanan-Packingham line. That's our treaty line, and that is where Oregon ends today, and that is where the border between the United States and Canada ends today also. You can also see Vancouver Island in this picture. So the second campaign promise that Polk had made was to, quote, re-annex Texas. So let's look a little bit about the history of the United States with Texas. By the 1830s, we do actually have a large number of Americans living in Texas. And the way that started was in 1821, an American, Moses Austin, had made a treaty with Spain when Spain still controlled Mexico and Texas. And in that treaty, Moses Austin promised that he would bring 300 families into Texas, and in exchange for that, Spain would give him a very large land grant. The reason this was important was because Spain was having a difficult time getting civilized inhabitation of Texas. We have many Native American tribes that are considered to be very warlike in the Texas region, and so a lot of people did not want to move into Texas, and so they said, hey, let's get these crazy Americans too. So Moses Austin began moving Americans into Texas after 1821. Well, in 1824, Mexico won their independence from Spain, and so Texas became a province of Mexico. And Mexico renewed this agreement with Moses Austin that we would continue to bring American families into Texas for the same reason. They also needed civilized inhabitation of the area. So fast forward a few years, Americans have been living in Texas along with many Tejanos or Mexicans, and so they began to develop rich planting areas. East Texas was well known for growing cotton, and for the most part, Mexico had a very loose control over Texas, allowing the Texans to do pretty much what they wanted to do. For instance, in Texas, these Americans that moved in could own land even though they were not Catholic. And in Mexico, you had to be Catholic to own land. The Americans were also allowed to bring slaves into Texas, while Mexico did not allow slavery. So they had a pretty loose control over Texas for much of that time. But in the mid-1830s, Santa Anna became the dictator of Mexico, and he really clamped down on the control of Texas, but all of Mexico, because he is a dictator. And he began to enforce more rules on Texas, and many of the Texans, including the Tejanos that were living there, were upset about these rules, which they felt violated their rights as Mexican citizens. And so we will have, beginning in 1836, the Texas Revolution. This is not a Texas history class, so we're not going to go into great detail about the Texas Revolution, but we all know the story of Santa Anna and his huge army marching into San Antonio and attacking the Alamo and slaughtering all of the defenders there at the Alamo, which then became the rallying cry of the Texas Revolution. And in 1836, Texas did win their independence from Mexico after defeating Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto. And for 9 years, Texas was an independent country known as the Lone Star Republic. By the time we get to 1844, there's beginning to be a huge push in Texas to be annexed to the United States. And there are a lot of very practical reasons for that. One was for trade. As a foreign country, Texas was subject to tariffs when they wanted to trade with the United States, and so economically it would be better for them to be part of the United States. And secondly, Texas was having a border dispute with Mexico over where Texas actually ended. The Texans said that that Texas ended at the Rio Grande, while Mexico said that Texas ended at the Nueces River. And so Texas felt that if they were annexed to the United States, that they would have the protection of the United States from Mexico. So the point I'm trying to make is that the United States did not arbitrarily grab Texas and annex it. There was a huge push within Texas to be annexed to the United States. Shortly before leaving office, President Tyler had tried to annex Texas, but he had failed to get a majority of votes in Congress to do that. And so that is why Polk is pushing for us to annex Texas when he becomes president. And in 1845, soon after he is inaugurated, the United States will annex Texas to the United States. And by December of 1845, Texas becomes a state. Texas did not have to go through a territorial period because they already were a country, they had a constitution, and so they were expedited and made a state immediately. This is just that very famous picture that we've all seen of the Alamo as part of the Texas Revolution. Well, as you can imagine, after annexing Texas, the tensions between the United States and Mexico did become greater, which is what Henry Clay had been afraid of during the election. But Polk seemed to be oblivious to this, and he saw the opportunity now that we have Texas and we're beginning to settle our Oregon question, that if we could go ahead and buy California, then we could complete our manifest destiny. So President Polk decided to send a envoy, John Slidell, to Mexico with an offer to buy California for $25 million. When Slidell got to Mexico, he was not received very well by the Mexican government. Actually, they threatened to arrest him if he did not leave the country, and so the Slidell mission failed. But Polk is very determined that he wants to annex California. He wants to buy California. So if Mexico will not sell us California, how can we get California? And of course, the answer to that is that we will have to take it, which will probably result in going to war. Well, here in the United States, Polk knew that a war of aggression to take land would not be well received. So what he has to do basically is engineer a war and make it look like Mexico started the war. So what he decides to do is he will send an American army under General Zachary Taylor into that disputed area of Texas, that disputed area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. He's hoping that by doing this, that the Mexican government will see it as an act of aggression and they will attack us, and we can say that they attacked us first. So in January of 1846, he sends this American army into that disputed region. But for the next 3 months, there's really a standoff because the Mexican government also doesn't really want to go to war. But finally, in April of 1846, the Mexican army will cross the Rio Grande and they will attack Zachary Taylor's troops. And in the course of that fighting, of course, there were casualties on both sides. This now gives President Polk the excuse he was looking for to go to war. So he will send a war resolution to Congress, asking Congress to declare war on Mexico because American blood has been spilled on American soil. Well, most of the Congress were ardent expansionists, and they went right along with this war declaration. But there was a young congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, who saw this really as a war of aggression. And so Abraham Lincoln introduced what became known as the Spot Resolution. In the Spot Resolution, he asked to know the exact spot on American soil where American blood had been spilled. Now, of course, the point he's trying to make is that this is actually disputed land, that Mexico could say the same thing. They could say that Mexican blood had been spilled on Mexican soil. But Abraham Lincoln is outnumbered, and he will lose that vote, and Congress will declare war on Mexico. And so in 1846, we will have what is known as the Mexican-American War. This is a map that shows us that disputed region. You can see that purple area was what was recognized by Mexico as the Republic of Texas, and then that striped area was that disputed region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, which of course is a very huge territory that we will be fighting for. Of course, one of the major aspects of this war, one of the main reasons we're going to war with Mexico in 1846 is because we want California. So one of the very first thing that President Polk did after the war declaration passed was he decided to send an American army under Colonel Stephen Kearny to California. So Kearny will leave and move along the Santa Fe Trail with the ultimate goal of getting to California and joining up with a nationalist group in California. Now, there was a group in California, like Texas, that were opposed to the strict Mexican government there. It's a rather small group. It's not as well organized as the Texas group. But Kearny's goal was to join up with them and help them overthrow the Mexican government. But while Kearny's army is moving along the Santa Fe Trail, that nationalist group in California will go ahead and start the revolution. And by the time Kearny and the American forces get there, the revolution is pretty much over. They have overthrown the Mexican government in California. They were able to do this because they did receive help from another American, John Fremont. Fremont was a trader that had some ships in the California harbors, and he had a great deal of weaponry on those ships, and he was able to provide those to the nationalists in California and help California win their independence. And so for a brief time, California was an independent country also, and they were known as the Bear Flag Republic. So if you've ever looked at the California flag and wondered why there's a big bear on it, that's the reason. It's the same reason we have the Lone Star on our Texas flag. They were the Bear Flag Republic. Meanwhile, back in Texas and Mexico, we will continue our invasion of Mexico. We're going to have two armies that are going to be moving into Mexico. One is that General Zachary Taylor's old Rough and Ready army that's going to be moving into Mexico from Texas. Meanwhile, General Winfield Scott, who is leading the main American force, will make a amphibious landing at Veracruz. Veracruz is a harbor city in southern Mexico, and Winfield Scott's army will be moving northward from Veracruz up toward Mexico City, while Zachary Taylor's army is going to be moving southward toward Mexico City, with the ultimate goal of both armies getting to Mexico City, surrounding it, and laying siege to the city. Along the way, Zachary Taylor is going to fight one of the probably most memorable battles of the Mexican-American War, known as the Battle of Buena Vista. In this battle, Zachary Taylor was outnumbered almost 10-1 by Santa Anna's army, yet he was able to defeat Santa Anna's army in this rather huge battle, which pretty much freed him up to get to Mexico City. Winfield Scott's army will continue moving upward, and so by the time we get to 1847, we have both of the American armies have reached Mexico City and began to lay siege to the city. Traveling with Winfield Scott's army was a diplomat, Nicholas Trist. Polk had sent Trist along so that as soon as possible we could negotiate a peace agreement with Mexico to bring it into the war when we got the lands that we wanted. Well, as the city is laid under siege, as often happens, the inhabitants, mostly civilian inhabitants of Mexico City, suffer a great deal, because when a city is under siege, you begin to run out of food and medical supplies. And so Santa Anna asked for an armistice so that he could take care of his wounded and take care of the citizens. And the United States actually agreed to this with him. And we actually even loaned him money. We loaned him $10,000 to help him provide for the needs of his people. Soon after we made this armistice and loaned him this money, we realized that Santa Anna had played us for a fool, really. He took the money and he began to reinforce his army, and he wasn't using it to help his people. So we renewed the siege of the city. And the siege of Mexico City is actually a very horrific engagement for the citizens there, because they do really begin to suffer greatly during this siege time. Because of their suffering, there's a huge movement within the population of Mexico to overthrow Santa Anna. And by the time we get to late 1847, Santa Anna has been overthrown, and the new Mexican government asked for an armistice to truly begin peace talks. And so we will begin these peace talks, and in February of 1848, we will negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with Mexico to end the Mexican-American War. Under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico will recognize the Rio Grande as the border of Texas. Mexico will also give the United States California in what we call the Mexican Cession, which we're going to see on the map on the next slide in just a minute. That Mexican Cession would include New Mexico, Nevada, all of those huge lands there. And the United States will pay Mexico $15 million. And so with the conclusion of this treaty, the Mexican-American War will end, and the United States will basically have achieved our manifest destiny, controlling the lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This is the map I was referring to. You can see that light green area that is called the Mexican Cession. You can see that huge amount of territory that was included. We now gained that purple area, the disputed area, and there's just one little piece of land that we're going to buy from Mexico in 1853, known as the Gadsden Purchase, when we are beginning to build railroads and we need that land to build a railroad. And then our manifest destiny will be complete. The United States will control the lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The end of the Mexican-American War, with the acquisition of all of that territory, renewed that long-standing question in America of slavery. By the time we get to the mid to late 1840s, the abolitionist movement has been growing in the United States and has gotten much stronger. And there is a movement in the United States to stop the expansion of slavery. When we're looking at the 1840s, we're not looking at, for the most part, abolishing slavery in the South, in the states where it already is. What we're looking more at in the 1840s is stopping the expansion of slavery. So soon after the Mexican-American War, a congressman introduced what became known as the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso provided that slavery would be prohibited in any territory acquired in the Mexican-American War. Now, that would not apply to Texas, because Texas had been annexed actually before the Mexican-American War, but it would apply to California and all of the other territories that had been acquired in the war. The Wilmot Proviso passed Congress because there is a majority of non-slave states in Congress, but in the Senate there is still an equal number of free and slave states, and since there's equal representation in the Senate was able to stop the passage of the Wilmot Proviso. But the question of slavery in the territories will not go away. It is going to be a question in all of the upcoming elections as we move to this decade prior to the American Civil War beginning. In 1849, gold was discovered in California, and this is going to really expedite California's growth and push for California to become a state much quicker than many had anticipated. It will also expedite the question of slavery in the territories. With the California Gold Rush, we're going to have thousands and thousands of people moving from all over the United States and even from Europe to California in the hopes of finding gold and getting rich quick. And so the population of the state will grow very, very quickly, and California will request admission to statehood in late 1849, moving into 1850. When California requested admission for statehood, this is going to upset the balance between the free and slave states. Since the Missouri Compromise, the Congress had been trying to bring in states in pairs, one free state paired with one slave state. That had managed to keep the peace in the country for that 30-year period since the Missouri Compromise. But when California asked for admission as a state, there is no other state that is ready for admission. So however California decides, if they decide to come in as a free state or slave state, it will upset the balance between the free and slave states. As it would happen, California requested admission as a free state. There had not been slavery in California while they belonged to Spain or to Mexico, and so the citizens there saw no reason to bring slavery into the question at this point. So this upset the Southerners, because they know that the one thing that has helped them is that they have been able to hold on to the Senate, and so when the North tried to pass laws that were unfavorable to the South, they were able to stop those laws from being passed. But if California comes in as a free state, they will lose that advantage. So there begins to be discussion among the southern states that if California were admitted as a free state, that maybe the southern states should secede from the Union. Fortunately, at this time, most Americans did not want the South to secede from the Union. And so Henry Clay, who's still around, is going to come up with a compromise known as the Compromise of 1850. In the Compromise of 1850, California would be admitted as a free state, as they had requested. But in the rest of the Mexican cession, in the rest of that territory, popular sovereignty would be used to determine the status of slavery. And so what popular sovereignty means is that you would allow the people in that territory to vote, to decide whether they wanted to have a free or a slave territory and then a free or slave state. So instead of the government drawing a line like we had done in the Missouri Compromise, we would let the people of the territory determine the status of slavery in that territory. Another question that came up was the slave trade. By the 1850s, a lot of Americans are beginning to feel that the slave trade, even though we've outlawed the international slave trade, we still have the internal slave trade, that the slave trade is an abomination in America, and they wanted to abolish the slave trade in our country. So the compromise they came up with here really just deals with Washington, D.C., our capital. They said that the slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be abolished in Washington, D.C. So at least in the nation's capital, there would no longer be the slave auctions that they had. The Southern senators and congressmen could bring their slaves to Washington when they came for meetings of Congress. Slavery would be allowed in Washington, D.C., but no longer would there be slave trade in Washington, D.C. One of the things that the Southerners began to push for was a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. Since the beginning of our country, since we had slavery, we had Fugitive Slave Acts, which made it illegal for slaves to run away. However, they were very loosely enforced, and pretty much if a runaway slave got into a northern territory, they were free. So the new Fugitive Slave Act, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, would be much stronger. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 would allow slave catchers to pursue runaway slaves into free territories, and if they captured an accused runaway slave, that accused runaway slave would be denied a trial by jury or the right to call witnesses on their own behalf. So the new Fugitive Slave Act is going to become very controversial. Actually, the whole Compromise of 1850 is very controversial. There's very long debate over it. President Taylor really did not support the compromise. He doesn't support the compromise because he says that we shouldn't have to have this type of compromise. California wanted to come into the Union as a free state. They should have been allowed to come into the Union as a free state with no objections. In the midst of this very long debate over the Compromise of 1850, President Taylor will die of a stomach disorder, and Millard Fillmore, his vice president, will take over. Millard Fillmore was a more practiced politician than President Taylor, and so he recognizes the need for compromise, and he begins to support the compromise. Stephen A. Douglas, who was a leading Democrat, will also support the compromise. And eventually, by breaking the compromise out into actually individual bills, they were able to get enough of the votes to get the compromise passed, but they had to break it out into individual bills. The Fugitive Slave Act becomes the most controversial of those bills It's the one thing that the Southerners really felt that they gained from the compromise, but it is also the one thing that really upsets the Northerners, because when we look at the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it would actually be possible for a free black residing in a free territory to be captured by a slave catcher and be accused of being a slave and being brought into slavery. And so what we see with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is it actually pushes more Americans in the North to becoming abolitionists, to actually coming out against slavery. Before this, we saw many Americans who disagree with slavery, but they said, well, it's really not our business. It doesn't affect me. But now many Northerners are beginning to see that slavery does affect them, because free blacks residing in their states could be accused of being slaves and be taken into slavery. This map shows us our Compromise of 1850 line. The purple states, the dark purple states, are our slave states, and you can see your Missouri Compromise line, which is still in place for the time being. California is a free state, as are those kind of light beige states, are all free states. And then that light purple is the area that would be allowed to choose based on popular sovereignty, whether they wanted to be free or slave states. As we were saying in the previous slides, the Fugitive Slave Act really pushed a lot of Americans to become affiliated more with abolitionism, because they were afraid that it would affect slavery in their state and bring slavery to their state by bringing these slave catchers in. The Fugitive Slave Act also influenced the publication of a book entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a work of fiction, but is something we call historical fiction, because she had traveled in the South and she had seen slavery, and so she wrote this book. Uncle Tom was not a real person. He was a conglomeration of many people that she had experienced. But what she does in this book is she humanizes slavery. Before Uncle Tom's Cabin, we see that most anti-slavery literature was written political dissertations that most people really weren't that interested in and could not maybe understand to a great deal. But in Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe makes the slaves real people. Uncle Tom is this wonderful character who was loyal to his first master and took care of the young girl of his second master. There was Liza, whose son was going to be sold away from her, and she steals her son and runs to freedom. And so who can't identify with a mother trying to protect her child? And Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes this national bestseller. It also becomes very widely read in Europe. And it begins to take slavery out of this political realm and show that slaves were human beings. They were people that had feelings just like anyone else, and that what they were experiencing was horrific. And so we see that Uncle Tom's Cabin will also begin to push more people into the abolitionist camp, especially in the North. Uncle Tom's Cabin was banned in most southern states. They said it was an unrealistic depiction of slavery. So the book was banned, which is something we don't often see in American history, books being banned. And the book was so influential. There's a quote that President Abraham Lincoln is supposed to have said to Harriet Beecher Stowe during the Civil War when she was visiting the White House. So he said, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war," because the book did have a huge impact on the abolitionist movement, helping bring about the Civil War in many cases.